So with that, let's move to the most exciting sessions that we have been waiting for in the morning. I'm pleased to welcome the first keynote speaker of the morning, Deirdre Hanford. She's the Chief Security Officer and the Corporate Staff at Synopsys. In this role, she works collaboratively to safeguard Synopsys as well as lead efforts to ensure the industry awareness and enablement for secure design. And we need to learn what that means, right? I think this is something new that we are listening these days. She served as the co-general manager of Synopsys Design Group, responsible for leading and the development and deployment of the physical design, implementation, and analog mixed signal product lines. Deirdre has a number of positions in Synopsys since joining the company in 1987, including the leadership roles in customer engagement, application engineering, sales, and marketing. She has a BS in EE from Brown University, an MS in EE from UC Berkeley, and in 2001, she was the recipient of the YWCA Tribute to Women in Industry Award and the Mary Pistoli Women in EDA Achievement Award. Ms. Hanford served as the chairman of American Electronics Association in 2008, and she currently chairs the Brown University's Engineering Advisory Committee and serves as the Engineering Advisory Board for UC Berkeley's College of Engineering. She also serves on the board of directors for Cirrus Logic. Welcome, Deirdre. We look forward to hearing from you. Over to you.
Thank you, Nitin. I'm going to bring up my presentation. Bear with me for just a minute. And we're almost there. Can I ask you to confirm that you can see it, Naveen?
Yes, we are good to go.
Okay. Naveen, thank you very much. And also, Dr. Gupta, thank you for the opening of this very important conference. So I'm super excited to be with you this morning. Good morning to you. It's evening here in Northern California at my home. I love the fact that you decided to go ahead with the virtual conference, and I am super excited to see so many attendees already logged in and ready to start a very productive two-day conference. This fourth International IEEE Test Conference in India is an important gathering of a community. And what I want to talk about today is how important test is, but also talk about how essential this emerging notion of hardware security is as well. And so, you know, I've had my very first hire of a test engineer back in 1990. We were just starting to get into design for test at Synopsys, and my job was to, as a new manager, my job was to hire a test engineer. And that's when I learned really quickly just how deeply knowledgeable everyone in test is. And frankly, you all are kind of an intimidating bunch, but I'm going to do my best today to share with you this concept, as I said, of test in the context of this emerging requirement for security. Briefly, I think you're all very familiar with Synopsys, so I'll keep this to one slide and quite brief. You know, we obviously are the leader in electronic design automation with verification and design tools. In fact, our test team lives within Design Group. We also have silicon engineering tools that help folks that are doing maybe new device creation or the steps along the way to manufacturing, like optical proximity correction. That's a very large business for us as well. We have an IP group which sells building blocks for folks that are doing SoC design. And then our newest business unit is now 6 years old, and that's the group that helps people design high quality and highly secure software. So we really are focused on the whole stack of silicon to software as a company. So that's going to be my quick introduction on Synopsys, in case you hadn't heard of us. But let's shift gears and look at the semiconductor market. There's some really exciting growing markets in this space that are driving some new requirements. Obviously, I remember about 3 years ago or so, the first network showed up on an application processor in a cell phone, and people are like, what are you going to do with that device? But now you see AI basically popping up everywhere on IoT devices on the edge, and certainly there's a lot of AI going on in data center. Automotive as well has been bursting with more and more electronics as we look for more electronics enhancing our experience in the car, but more importantly, more driver assist capabilities all the way to, you know, autonomous driving capabilities being driven by electronics. And of course, IoT is popping up everywhere, And there's a number of excitements in that market. If you look at the consumer spaces you see depicted on the slide, but you also look at, exciting areas in industrial and medical and, around our homes increasingly. But each of these markets bring forth a new set of requirements. Certainly safety is essential in automotive and in the health industry. Reliability is super important in all these markets, but all these markets as well are looking increasingly for devices and for the entire system to be secure. And that's going to be the heart of my presentation today. Now, as the Chief Security Officer, my job is to secure Synopsys assets, number one. But number two, my job is to help the company think about this emerging aspect of security. And, I think security is super interesting, but the thing that bothers me about security is, I feel like we're always playing defense. You're kind of trying to prevent something from happening. And I think that that's not as fun as trying to make something cool happen. But let me give you some simple examples of, how security gone wrong can really create challenges for a business. So this is a crazy example of someone breaking into a casino's, high roller database by going through the thermostat, the internet-enabled thermostat of a fish tank in the casino. And while that sounds crazy, I know at Synopsys we had a team go and look at every single internet-enabled device in our network and make sure that it was in fact secure. And so this is something that you think would be a non-issue, but in this increasingly connected world, it does become a big issue and provide a vulnerability for an enterprise. Of course, this big example back in August of 2017 was really a watershed for the automotive industry. Someone hacked into a Jeep and was able to actually stop that Jeep dead in its tracks. And this was, super scary because the automotive industry is so known for safety. But the automotive industry didn't realize the massive extent of software that was showing up inside of cars. And they really weren't thinking about security in the software stack, much less the microelectronic stack that we're all responsible for. And then this example is kind of for bragging rights. Here's someone that actually hacked into, basically the folks that were on wireless on an airplane. But it shows you that we think of these devices and these large things like airplanes as being super secure. And well, maybe they're not that secure after all. Now, as design engineers, we've thought about security ourselves as, network security, the realm of the IT organization, and maybe software security, like you saw that car getting hacked into through the software infrastructure. But essentially, we now need to think about security throughout the entire design process, not for all applications, but for applications where security is going to be really important. This has ramifications for SoC level, for IP, and even for things like sensors. And so we're going to talk about this aspect of security and how it's going to be impacting us really for the next decade. So when you think about design, when I go visit customers in India, like I did about a year ago, I miss being back there. I was supposed to be back again this April. If I visit someone like a Qualcomm or a Xilinx or a Western Digital, Intel, whomever, we talk on and on and on about power, performance, and area. That is what drives the greatness of our semiconductor devices. And the metrics really vary depending on the application that you're focused on. But now increasingly, we're seeing a fourth dimension show up in design, and that has to do with security. And so now there's a new term being coined called PAS: power, area, speed, and security. And like with PPA, this fourth metric, this fourth dimension, also can at times be in conflict with the others. And this, again, creates a challenge for us and one that we need to comprehend in our design flows. So that's a quick introduction to kind of security is frankly playing a lot of defense, but we need to have very resilient systems. And there's a new metric that's being driven called security that's now competing with power, performance, and area in designs. So now let's take a look at why would people hack hardware? What are the motivations for hacking hardware? And what are the methods that are being used to hack hardware? And here you can see on the left a number of different motivations like economic gain, just plain IP theft. I visited a customer in Taiwan that was pretty sure that someone had stolen their masks, essentially, and were fabricating a counterfeit device. There's sabotage, and then there's espionage. And so there's a whole host of really motivations for hacking any system, and in this case, hacking hardware. And then there's different methods. And this is kind of a cute historical picture of someone, painstakingly reverse engineering a device. And certainly it was easier when chips were at much larger feature sizes and maybe 1 or 2 layers of metal. But it's still possible today to actually reverse engineer a device. And in fact, I visited some government labs where that work was underway. In the particular case I'm aware of, they actually had such an old part that was so obsolete that they needed to figure out what it was doing because that part was still deployed in a military system. But reverse engineering is, the realm of a hacker as well, and something we really need to be sensitive to. But another method is called a side channel attack. And side channel attacks are quite interesting because in these attacks, you're essentially looking at, measurable elements of a device. And so that could be something like, it could be the power, it could be, the emissions of a device, it could be a number of different, sequences coming off a chip. And if you're carefully listening and closely monitoring, you can learn a lot about what's happening in a particular device. For instance, you could look at the power of a device and try and get a sense of what's happening when the system is, for instance, working with the RSA key. So this could be a case where there's IP theft or espionage underway because you're essentially snooping on a device. And this is a great example from ETH Zurich's research lab, where they were able to actually look at the power signals during the RSA sequence and understand and basically decrypt what was happening during that sequence by watching here squaring and multiplication occurring throughout the sequence of the design. So this is a pretty elaborate capability, but it's interesting to see that if you really want to kind of snoop on a device, you can learn an awful lot if you know what you're looking for. Now another area is this notion of malicious hardware. And malicious hardware are better known as Trojans. And this is a scary, scary phenomenon as well. Because let's say you license some third-party IP. You're kind of trusting that that IP does what it says on the data sheet. Well, maybe someone has inserted some malicious code into that IP that you're synthesizing, and maybe you're putting some malicious content onto your device unknowingly. Another aspect of it could be when you go through to manufacturing, maybe there's an untrusted person as part of that flow that again is inserting some nefarious or bad malicious logic into your device. And these Trojans can be woken up later on and perform, acts of sabotage or espionage and have great unintended consequences. I'm super happy to see on the program, I think there are at least 2 or 3 sessions tomorrow at this conference where hardware Trojans are going to be analyzed. And I really, really applaud the fact that the test industry is thinking about, how can you detect these? How can you make sure that no unintended logic is showing up on a particular device? So let's leave Trojans for a minute, and I encourage those of you that are interested in this domain to go ahead and attend those sessions on Tuesday. And let's talk about supply chain. I don't know if you all remember, but Bloomberg published an article, I think a couple summers ago, maybe 3 summers ago, I can't quite remember, about supermicro servers. And they had done a teardown, and they contended that someone in the supply chain who was manufacturing a supermicro server blade had inserted a small device onto that server board that enabled someone to snoop on the device. And this put a chill through the industry. Everyone was saying, do you use supermicro servers? Well, we do at Synopsys. And folks were trying to understand, would there possibly be someone snooping? What was going on? And that really, really scared a number of people. But supply chain attacks are pretty tricky because, devices are designed so globally. They're designed through so many different hands along the chain, just at a semiconductor level, much less at a board, subsystem, or system level. And so there's an awful lot of opportunity through that process as it goes through many, many hands to, basically perform some kind of damaging to the device, or inserting a gray market device that maybe was reclaimed from recycled parts, etc. So supply chain attacks are also very, very serious. Well, this is what, kind of reinforces what we talk about as like a threat landscape. And if you're designing a security chip, you would actually have to be thinking about what's the threat model, and then how do you mitigate the risks of those threats. But essentially, the semiconductor threat landscape starts in design, goes through manufacturing, assembly, test, and distribution. There's a number of areas across the board where something bad and unintended could happen to the design. So this gives us a pretty broad landscape, and one to really think about how to protect. And being a security target is quite costly. Now, obviously, there's brand damage if your company was hacked in a high-profile case. I know personally, I shop a lot at Target, and Target had a hack several years ago through the HVAC system, and for years I kept in my wallet the Target receipt because I had shopped there during the time where their systems had been compromised. Therefore, my banking data had been stolen. And, it took me a long time to trust Target again. And that's, a typical consumer experience. But you can see the data here that an average cost of a data breach could be, $8.2 million. So there's a hard financial cost as well as reputational damage. And interestingly, companies now are starting to buy cyber insurance to protect themselves against all the costs associated with mitigating a data breach. So we talked about paths, and we talked about the methods and motivation for hardware hacks. I want to switch gears now and talk about a really important concept that is well known in the network industry called zero trust, but that concept is coming to chip design. And this is something that I think we're going to hear more and more about over the next few years. Now, essentially, when you think about our supply chain, as I mentioned previously, there's chips that are being designed across continents. They're being assembled in one location, then they're being handed off to manufacturer at a foundry, who in turn hands it off to, test house, assemblies, et cetera, et cetera. Ultimately the chip is provisioned, and it goes off into a larger system. So, you could decide that I'm going to design things in a pure trusted environment, but that's not really practical in this global supply chain that we all work in. So the notion of zero trust is a little bit different. It essentially requires that you don't trust anyone or anything in the full chain. Instead, you use what we call quantifiable assurance, or essentially that you use visibility, analytics, and automation to constantly assess, is this device trusted? Should I continue on, or maybe should I shut down and protect my assets? So the zero trust concept is coming to us in chip design. And so I want to spend the next few minutes exploring this important concept. To set the stage, I want to share with you a contract that we're super excited to be involved in. We were recently awarded by DARPA a contract called Automatic Implementation of Secure Silicon. And I'll get to what that means in a minute, but it's super exciting because this contract is a 4-year contract, and everything that DARPA does is dubbed DARPA Hard, which I think is very exciting. But this contract is really, really intent on enabling secure silicon, enabling that concept of zero trust, but doing it in a specific way. And as you can see here, we have a host of exciting partners on this program. We're the prime contractor, but we're super proud to work with industry partners as well as some very important academic partners in this effort. And, it's exciting to be on some internal seminars where we brought many of our partners together to share some of the really exciting research that they're doing at the university level in this important space. But I want to spend a minute on the this notion of ACE, because we've been handed a number of goals in this program. And essentially, we want to make sure we enable the creation of threat-resistant design, but we want to do that in a configurable way. Because I mentioned, before, PASS is not just security only. There are other requirements in a design. And if you're designing, as the program manager at DARPA likes to say, the controller for a front yard sprinkler system, that's going to have a different security requirement than if you're designing the control system, say, for a nuclear power plant. And so depending on your target, you're going to want to configure how much security gets employed in the design. It's also important, though, that in this program, we make security easy to implement and a natural product of the flows that we know so well. Synthesis and verification, place and route, design for test ATPG, etc. We want to make sure that it's natural and also make sure that security is comprehensive. And we'll talk later about some of the other aspects of security that need to be considered in a full design flow. And bottom line, it needs to be impactful. What I like about many government-sponsored programs, and DARPA programs in particular, they're always looking for partners that want to basically take this beyond research. Research is so important, but they also want to look for a commercial outlet or a practical outlet for the work that they're funding. And we're excited as an industry partner, and hopefully we're a partner that can take many of these great ideas out to market to give value to folks in the design flow. But I want to introduce this concept of this ACE program because we've been challenged through this program to also help implement this notion of zero trust in chip design. So I want to spend a couple minutes on what does that mean for SoC designs. Well, first of all, if you look at a typical SoC, this is a very simplistic view, but essentially you have, a CPU that kind of is the boss and controls things. But in increasingly heterogeneous environments, you have a number of other devices that are sitting on that bus. GPUs, image processors, neural networks, you've got DRAM controllers, you've got local memory, etc. So this is kind of a chip that might need to operate in a zero trust environment. So if it's going to operate in a zero trust environment, it's a little bit lacking and we've got some work to do. So let's look at what we need to layer on. Well, first and foremost, we need to layer on a security blanket or a root of trust security enclave, if you will. And this security enclave is really in charge of bringing that safe place where the chip comes up with safe code that it's operating to boot itself. And this is a place where hopefully throughout the entire process, this area of the chip is impenetrable and doesn't get compromised. But in addition to that, the chip, that root of trust is charged with kind of assessing what's going on in the chip, assessing each of the elements sitting on the bus, and deciding are they okay or have they been compromised, and basically enable them to play ball on the chip. So this is essentially the basic role of a root of trust. But there are a number of things that you can layer on. You can layer on policy. So let's take a look and understand a little bit more about what that means. There are a number of things that the root of trust can take care of. It can take care of secure boot and storage of that secure code. It can handle cryptographic keys and managing those keys. It can handle secure debug and test access. And it can handle the ability to perform even secure updates to software and firmware. I know, for instance, like Microsoft has recently introduced Azure Sphere, which are secure IoT devices. And I know that companies like Qualcomm, NXP, and MediaTek, and I think a few others, have introduced Azure Sphere secure devices. They're utilizing this kind of concept to ensure that these devices have security, but also the ability to update over the air over time. But in addition to those initial policies, if you add like runtime access control policies, detection of aberrant or abnormal behavior, and measurement and attestation of subsystem states, then suddenly you have a root of trust subsystem that maybe could even detect a hack. And then finally, if you're incorporating the means to enable and disable some of the SoC capabilities and the ability to provide identification and authentication, then you really have the ability to handle certified devices. So this is a really important layer in addition to the root of trust, this notion of policy. But if you layer on top of security policies, access controls, then you've got some really interesting zero trust implementations. And you'll notice in this picture that there's some little firewalls that have been added. Those firewalls are essentially, controlling access to the system bus. And those can be done statically or dynamically, and basically governed by how the root of trust sees things going. And so you might have, in addition to that, MPUs, MMUs, and IO MMUs that can provide limits to various memory registers. We all remember from Spectre and Meltdown that there was, the ability to jump into the secure part of memory that was supposed to be protected. And then, you can also have multi-region encryption and authentication of external or shared memories as well. So suddenly that simple subsystem that we looked at a few slides ago is much more complex, and one that really is stepping up to being able to provide this notion of zero trust, constantly evaluating the integrity of the system and constantly making decisions about, who and what is able to do things on this chip. So that's a pretty exciting notion of being able to, monitor behaviors, keep an eye on power levels, reset levels, bus traffic, and really be thinking about the overall health of the system. So architects today of secure devices are thinking about these types of architectural choices, these types of configurations, and we as an industry need to really enable them. So that's a quick introduction to this concept of zero trust, one that I hope you'll think about over the course of this conference as you're sitting through a variety of different sessions. So now I want to switch gears and go into the next phase of the presentation, and that's to talk about design for security solutions. Now, there's a number of ways that chip design teams think about how to design security into the chip, in addition to those concepts of zero trust that they're doing really at an architectural level. Well, there's things like logic locking, obfuscation, encryption, and watermarking. Let me just spend a sentence or two on each of them so you get a feel for these particular solutions. So logic locking locks the circuit until it's enabled by a key. So it doesn't necessarily hide the circuitry, it just locks it. Sometimes it splits it off, and until you have a particular key to unlock the circuitry, you can't gain access to the full functionality of a chip. Logic obfuscation actually hides the structure of the circuit that needs to be protected by adding other things into the circuitry. And encryption is really a combination of obfuscation and locking. It combines those two to obscure a design and protect the chip from functioning correctly unless a decryption key is deployed. And watermarking is a latent circuitry that can be used remotely to triggered to produce a device authenticator. And this, by sending a special string into a particular device, then you can determine if this is legit or not. And in fact, I know one particular IP company that watermarks all of their IP. And I think that's quite interesting when you think about they want to preserve their capabilities. So all of these are enabled by design flows. And these are, really need to be looked at more carefully to understand some of the consequences as they're, stirred into the pot of everything else that gets optimized. Well, if this is your domain, so we're going to talk a little bit about SCAN, right? So SCAN access, for better or for worse, is hacker access. Your measure is observability and controllability. Observability and controllability. Well, for a security person, that's a nightmare. So here we have things at odds with one another. And, basic test obviously gives quite a bit of access. If you add compression, well, you add a measure of security in addition to that, because you have a big decompressor on the front end, and then you've got a compactor, a compressor on the back end. And these muxes and XORs provide a measure of obfuscation, but really, if you're really hell-bent on getting access to the device, you can get in through these mechanisms. So please talk about that at the conference. Even, linear equations, logic BIST, which is seeded with, is a compression scheme that's given a seed, you can still access through the LFSR and then come out through the miser, and you can actually have the ability to get in there. It's harder, but it's still capable. But if you think about the full DFT fabric, you've got core to core, you have die to die, and finally you even have, global access points all the way out to, for high-speed test that go all the way out to a tester through 1149.10, or maybe even to a system-level USB or PCIe connection, which we're increasingly seeing for high-speed test. And so if you think about it from a security standpoint, this is like a super highway for hackers. You're like giving me access, come on in, come in and do whatever you need to do to access, crypto keys or what have you. So we really need to think about the trade-offs here between DFT and security. So of course, what can we do here? Well, we can add some locking functions that would essentially clamp off aspects of the circuit that we don't want access during certain phases of either test or mission mode. So locking functions could have some solutions here, but I think for a while we're going to constantly have these two phenomena really opposing one another. And that kind of brings me to this concept of this opposing forces of test, where we're adding in a lot of test logic, and security, where we're saying, no, don't make anything available. So how do we reconcile these two opposing systems? How do we get these two teams and two requirements to work closely in concert? And I think that's why conferences like this are so important to enhance the discussion and bring these to the fore. Now, I want to share with you some of the things some of the things we talk about in our ACE program, or in about design for security in general, is how do you introduce these techniques and do it in a smooth fashion rather than have it be a completely foreign overlay on a normal design flow. So here's a particular design through in synthesis. We want to perform obfuscation and locking. So here you can see the introduction of, it's a simple scenario, but some introduction of some locking and obfuscation logic, and that logic is essentially unlocked with that secure key. And so this is, essentially what needs to happen, but you want to make sure that this is happening smoothly and is coherent with the requirements of perhaps area or power, or most likely not interfering with whatever performance requirements you may have for that particular block. And so this creates a lot of challenges for us, but I think it's going to be important that certain portions of the design are locked off and inaccessible unless that key is deployed. Another thing to consider is, I love how powerful our optimization technologies are in EDA, and we love to take circuitry and make it better. And so if you think about that, let's say you have, a locking register that essentially is critically going to deploy in a design. Well, place and route may not know that that's a really important, very special register, and place and route may say, hey, I need to clone that for performance reasons. Well, you better make sure that your security protocol understands that this is a special register that's just been cloned. Or you may instead choose to tell place and route, don't clone these types of devices. Well, that place and route tool needs to understand that command, and therefore that's a command that needed to be added to the flow. So these are simple examples, but hopefully give you a feeling that every time we layer on something, we layer on safety, we layer on low power techniques, here we layer on security, it creates a new set of requirements for the implementation flow. And that's really where, the EDA industry is going to need to step up and, comprehend this without giving up all the other aspects that we're optimizing to, power, performance, and area. But as we move on to ATPG, then we start to think about, well, my only job in life is to get to as high test coverage as possible. That's my life as a test engineer. Well, we know that when you go into test mode, there's always that logic upstream that you can't actually test. And so that drags down your test coverage. Well, this could be the case in security as well. As you introduce new modes, there may also be logic that maybe is or isn't deployed during test mode and needs to be considered and needs to be evaluated whether or not it's actually functional before you provision and package a device. So this is a really, really big challenge that we have, to not only constantly work on improving our test coverage, but this is a big requirement to improve the security while not compromising on test. And I think that's again why we've observed that so many researchers and practitioners in the test area are increasingly opening up the realm of their research and considering how security needs to be considered in the flows as well. Now, it's interesting, though, when you go into actual testing, remember we did logic locking, or maybe we have keys that need to be deployed in order to turn on the full functionality of a device. Well, guess what? If you're going to test a device, you need to be able to unlock the chip so that you can access everything that needs to be functionally evaluated during ATPG, or evaluated for controllability and observability or manufacturing faults. So here we have a case where, somehow through the testing process, a key needs to get provisioned so that the device can truly be opened up and fully tested. So how is that going to work? Is the tester secure? Where does the key come from? Is that a secure key? There's so many different questions that need to be evaluated, and this is another aspect of something that we're looking at in the DARPA ACE program. Because what we realize is that you have an opportunity now through the cloud to do some asset identity management, provisioning, and deployment. And so we can see a future where the tester is actually talking to the cloud to download particular keys in order to do its job. But of course, that needs to be a very, very secure connection and needs to be handled in a very responsible manner. But I think this is an exciting area for the test community, because you're going to need to understand all aspects of security in order to do your job. So that's designed for security and how it kind of makes our already difficult job even tougher. But I want to go back to this picture for a minute, because once you realize that you can kind of talk to a chip and send in authentication or provisioning information through this cloud-based interface, then you start to think about, well, what else can I do? What else can I actually deploy? And how else can I talk to this chip, not just through the test process, maybe through the full life cycle? And that's where I'm really excited to share with you this new concept of Synopsys Silicon Lifestyle Management. Lifestyle management, that sounds even better. Sorry, lifecycle management. And this is a really interesting and brand new concept, where essentially we want to provide the ability to basically be in contact with a device through its entire life cycle. Not just at manufacturing and test and even into debug and bring up, but all the way into the field. And this is, once you realize that you have the ability to kind of talk to a chip at this level, your mind starts to really open up about all the types of things that you can do once you can connect that chip to a cloud with all hosts of intelligent analysis. And so let's look at how that might work. If you put monitors and sensors intelligently embedded throughout a chip, then those monitors and sensors and artifacts can actually be speaking to the cloud throughout the chip's life cycle. You can constantly be looking at what's happening on the chip. And, once you realize that that's possible, you can start to think about a number of things. For instance, I would much rather learn that a chip is about to fail than learn that the chip had just failed. And so, if you think about that Jeep incident where they shut down the car, well, wouldn't it be nice to be able to sense that a hacker's come onto the chip and basically do a delicate shutdown rather than have the car actually be taken over by a bad actor? Or if you've got maybe a gray market part that's ailing because it's a lot older than you thought it was, maybe that device is starting to fail. And through these sensors talking to the cloud, you can start to quickly determine that there's anomalous behavior in the device and, statistically very quickly determine that this device needs quick attention. So we're super excited about all the potential of this silicon lifecycle management capability and want you to stay tuned for what we think are going to be an awful lot of exciting enhancements coming down the pipe. Now, of course, security is going to be critical in that process also, because this chip's talking to something that's going to be sending back information or making decisions about the health of the chip. And so, you need to make sure that that's, again, a secure link. Of course, security ends up showing up everywhere once you start to think about it. But I think it's really essential here to also consider that, maybe if suddenly you see an awful lot of resets, or if you see a lot of current flowing, that, you are in a position now to take proactive action and hopefully do something elegant with that chip as maybe it starts to fail, or you have the ability to perhaps bypass some hacking. So we think that there's a huge future for silicon lifecycle management for us as an industry, and this is only the beginning. Now, the last thing I want to talk about briefly before we get into Q&A is just give you a feel for some other things that are happening. As you mentioned, I took on this job as Chief Security Officer because we have a lot of assets to protect like every other company, but we see security starting to show up across the design of chips as well as the software realm. And we think that this company-wide effort is going to really serve the industry well over the coming decade. I want to just give you a couple examples of a number of other areas where we're investing in security at Synopsys. So this is an area of near and dear to our hearts, which is our DesignWare Security IP Solutions group. And here you can see that if you're going to license, if you want to put, for instance, remember that root of trust into a particular device, we'll license you a programmable root of trust components to implement the policy and those core security functions that we talked about in that zero trust environment. We'll provide you with secure key management capabilities, protocol-aware cryptography, interface encryption, and supporting firmware for that root of trust as well. So this is really providing people that want to incorporate security onto their chips many of the building blocks that they will need in order to implement that security. But as much as we talked about test and implementation of security, there's also a big verification job that needs to happen. You have to make sure, for instance, that a register, a secure area or a secure enclave on the chip stays secure, that nothing leaks out of the secure island into other areas of the chip. Or similarly, you want to make sure that there's no overflow incidents where an unsecure access is provided to the secure section of the chip. And there's a whole new area of formal verification, research, and practice where we're able to actually formally verify that a secure area is in fact secure. And this is done with our BC Formal Security app. And in addition, and when we remember earlier, we talked about the whole notion of side channel attacks. You want to make sure that you can really model malicious attacks that can occur on a device. And you want to make sure that your chip is very resilient from all kinds of, fault attacks that may occur accidentally or maliciously. And using fault simulation, you can essentially detect just how robust your devices are and how resilient they are from these types of malicious fault attacks. So there's a host of capabilities across the design flow, and we're carefully investing in areas that we think will make an impact in security. Now, we've touched on all of these 6 areas. I hope that you came along with me for the ride. Security is a new element in design. There's a number of motivations and methods to hack hardware. There's a new concept of zero trust where essentially a device has to kind of constantly evaluate whether it can proceed. There's a number of techniques for design for security. And there's a whole new area of silicon lifecycle management. We're super excited to be pressing into this area as a company. That's one of the pieces that we're doing across the board, but there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done. I'd like to close, though, really with a big thank you. We're so proud to be a sponsor of this ITC India conference. Really thankful that the IEEE 4 years ago made the decision to form an ITC conference for the India community. We've actually participated in ITC conferences for well over 25 years. I know, when I hired a test engineer in 1990, I have to believe that we were participating in ITC even in 1990 or 1991. But we'll say at least a quarter of a century that we've been involved with ITC. For those of you that have joined us at Snug India, we always have a test track, and we're really always happy when we have the opportunity to present at ITC conferences here or around the globe. Test is, of course, an integral part of the very, very vibrant design community in India, and we're super excited and super happy and super humbled to have the opportunity to partner with you as you solve some of the very, very big challenges that we see in the test realm. So I wish you a great conference, and I hope that we have a few minutes for questions. Naveen, do we?
Yes, we do have time for a couple of questions. So while Kavita, can you ask the questions? And in the meantime, we can launch the poll also so that the participants can also give their quick feedback. Kavita?
Thank you. And I will note that I have some colleagues on the phone with me who are much smarter than I am. So if you guys stump me, hopefully one of my colleagues can help out.
So there were two questions. I think one has been answered. There's one question from St. Joseph's Engineering College. He's an undergrad, Shashank. And his question is, as concerns of IP security and trust increase, will use of open source IPs surpass that of proprietary IPs? For example, Open Titan Roof of Trust became popular since one cannot trust the closed source commercial IPs. Are proprietary IPs likely to become obsolete in the future, since Shannon's maxim says the enemy knows the system?
Oh boy, that's such a good question. And, I think we could debate this all day long. I have my own opinions, but we have a real expert in this on the call. That's my colleague, Mike Borza. Mike, if I could maybe suggest that you comment.
Sure. I think there is a possibility that some of these open source IPs will provide very good security solutions, and I'm not going to rule that out. But we've also seen in the case of software, there's some open source software which is highly secure. It's a standard for doing different kinds of security functions, and yet we've also seen other open source software which everybody relied on, and it was very important security software, or it is very important security software, and yet nobody was really looking at it because it was complicated and it was big and difficult. And so it was full of vulnerabilities that existed for 20 years, and very recently it's starting to get the attention it deserves because it was becoming the source of so many hacks. And so open source is a really great concept in terms of the idea that you have many eyeballs that are looking at it or that can look at it. But if nobody's actually doing the looking and nobody is charged with evaluating the security and what the implications of those things are, then it's not likely to be any more and could be much less secure than commercial products. So I think there's going to be room for both of these things for a long time. And, as you start thinking about things that actually need to be hardened into targeted GDS2 for particular processes, the benefits of open source IP start to go away because typically there's nobody paying for the test chips and the kinds of analysis and verification that needs to be done on those kinds of products, and those are some of the ones that have some of the biggest security implications. So, there are pluses and minuses to open source in that respect.
Well, and I think, we've seen that in the software realm as well. I attended a great presentation last year about how to evaluate open source software. And, some of the questions were, is there a governing body on that open source? How often is it updated? Is it vibrant open source versus is it open source that, it's kind of been put into a GitHub and nobody's paid any attention ever since. So I think, as with all things, there's potential. Thank you.
Well, even very vibrant open source communities actually, they can be some of the most vulnerable because people have the opportunity to slip things in and hope it goes unnoticed.
Naveen, is that okay?
That's good. We can take one more question and then we can close this. Kavita, any other question?
Yeah, there's one more question from Siddhartha, who's a PhD scholar from IIT Delhi. What security measures are taken in industry during post-silicon debug?
During post-silicon debug. So, Nitin, is that something you want to tackle?
Yeah. So I think we touched on this, and this is actually something that we're trying to consider as part of the ACE program as well. Again, it has to do with making sure that you have the right credentials and to properly authenticate and provision any device. So before you do any type of debug, there's a loop between the cloud and HSM, which is the hardware security module, and so that link or that loop becomes a tight loop, and in fact, that kind of authentication process starts all the way from design to post-silicon, right? So we've got the root of trust that does a lot of the arbitration throughout the design phase, and then similarly, as we get to the post-silicon world, there's more of a reliance on a secure container. Let's call it a hardware security module. This is something that actually we're working with as part of the ACE program. But really, I'd say that's going to be the key is just proper authentication before there's really any access to the circuit, to the device.
Well, maybe this is some work that we can, commission at IIT Delhi.
That's right.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you. We are a few minutes behind the time, but it was useful to go beyond because that was a pretty good talk. Deirdre, if you can unshare the screen, I would want to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. And Naveen, really thank you for hosting this most important conference.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. I think when we usually have hosted a lot of speakers, we tend to see that they cover a piece of IP or a design or a test or a area like automotive and all. But I think you've covered everything from the segment to the different process in the ecosystem. This was really helpful. Thank you so much, Deirdre, from all of us here in ITC, the organizing committee, and the participants to take your time in your late evening and give this interesting talk.
I love the plaque. Thank you so much. The best plaque ever, a virtual plaque. Thank you.
Thank you so much.